Welcome to the Ripple of Good channel. Listen to the story to the end and write your opinion in the comments. Enjoy your listening. The air was crisp as Emily locked her car outside the police academy. She had dreamt of this moment for years, stepping onto the campus where cadets became officers. But it wasn't just the badge that fueled her ambition. Emily had a passion for rescuing the vulnerable, human and animal alike. Her father's German shepherd, Max, had been her first hero. He'd saved her from a snake bite when she was 8, and his loyalty had stayed with her long after his passing. It was why Emily had volunteered at animal shelters through high school and college, seeing firsthand how broken lives could heal with patience and care. But none of those experiences prepared her for the moment she met Shadow. The shelter on the outskirts of town wasn't like the cozy nonprofits she'd worked at before. The air was thick with the smell of fear and despair, the barking of dogs a desperate cacophony of longing and hopelessness. Emily had come to drop off supplies, not expecting to encounter the dog that would change her life. In a corner cage, pressed against the back wall, sat a German shepherd. His coat, once a proud mix of tan and black, was matted and dull. Scars crisscrossed his legs and one ear drooped permanently. But it was his eyes that stopped Emily in her tracks. Eyes filled with pain, suspicion, and a glimmer of something she couldn't quite place. "Who's this?" she asked, her voice soft as she crouched near the cage. "That's Shadow," a tired volunteer replied. "Found him tied up behind a warehouse. No food, no water. He's been through hell. Won't let anyone near him." Emily's heart clenched. She knew what a dog like Shadow needed: patience, kindness, and a reason to believe in humanity again. But she was just starting her academy training. A high-maintenance dog wasn't in her plans. Yet as she stared into those haunted eyes, a spark of connection ignited. "Can I spend some time with him?" she asked. The volunteer hesitated. "You can try, but don't get your hopes up. He's different." The first attempt didn't go well. As soon as the cage door creaked open, Shadow's growl echoed through the small room. His teeth bared and his body was rigid with fear. Emily didn't push. Instead, she sat cross-legged a few feet away, her back turned slightly to him, and began to speak. She told him about Max, about her dreams of becoming a cop, about her belief that every soul deserved a second chance. He came back the next day and the day after that. Slowly, Shadow began to ease. He'd edge closer, his growls fading into watchful silence. But just when progress seemed within reach, tragedy struck. On the 5th visit, the shelter director approached Emily, her face grim. "Shadow's time is up," she said. "We're overcrowded and he's unadoptable. We can't keep him any longer." "No." Emily's voice cracked. "He's not unadoptable. He's just scared. Give me a little more time." The director sighed. "We don't have time, Emily. If you want him, you'll have to take him today." Emily's heart raced. She wasn't ready. Her apartment wasn't big enough. Her schedule was chaotic. But the thought of Shadow being put down was unbearable. "I'll take him," she said, her voice trembling but firm. As she drove home with Shadow in the back seat, trembling and curled in a tight ball, Emily felt the weight of what she'd just done. Shadow's journey to healing had begun, but she had no idea the challenges that lay ahead, or the dark secrets of Shadow's past that would soon come to light. The drive home was tense. Shadow stayed pressed against the farthest corner of the back seat, his trembling body a silent testament to his fear. Emily glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her heart aching. "It's okay, buddy," she murmured. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." But Shadow's unblinking stare told her he didn't believe a word of it. Emily's apartment was small but tidy, with a corner already prepared for Shadow. A soft bed, a few chew toys, and bowls of fresh food and water waited for him. She opened the door and gently coaxed him out of the car. Shadow hesitated, his paws gripping the edge of the seat like a lifeline. "Come on, boy," Emily said softly, kneeling to his level. She held out a treat, but he didn't budge. After several long minutes, she decided to lift him out. The moment her hands touched his fur, Shadow flinched and let out a sharp, panicked yelp. He twisted away, snapping his teeth in defense. Emily quickly stepped back, her hands raised in surrender. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll go slow." Eventually, Shadow crept out of the car on his own. He slunk into the apartment, his movements cautious and low to the ground. Once inside, he bolted to a corner behind the couch, where he curled into a tight ball. Emily sat on the floor, keeping her distance. She knew the first few days would be critical in earning his trust, but she hadn't expected it to be this hard. She left food and water near him and gave him space, only speaking in soft tones whenever she moved around the apartment. As the days passed, Shadow began to settle, if only slightly. He ate and drank when Emily wasn't looking and watched her every move with wary eyes. But any attempt to get closer resulted in growls or nervous retreat. One night, as Emily sat on the floor sorting through her academy notes, Shadow shifted from his corner. She froze, barely daring to breathe. Slowly, he padded a few steps closer, his movements tentative. He sniffed the air and stopped just out of arm's reach. "Hey, buddy," Emily said gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can come closer if you want. I won't hurt you." To her surprise, he took another step forward, his nose twitching as he eyed her with suspicion. Emily didn't move, letting him take the lead. Finally, Shadow stretched his neck forward and sniffed her hand. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The breakthrough, however, was short-lived. A few days later, Emily took Shadow for his first walk. She chose a quiet park where they could avoid crowds, hoping the fresh air would help ease his nerves. For a while it seemed to work. Shadow stayed close to her side, his ears swiveling at every rustle of leaves but otherwise calm. Then out of nowhere, a man on a skateboard whisked past, startling Shadow. His reaction was instant and violent. He lunged forward, barking and snarling, his teeth snapping wildly. The leash strained in Emily's hands as she struggled to pull him back. "Shadow, stop," she cried, her voice filled with panic. The man on the skateboard shouted something, his face a mix of fear and anger, before speeding away. Shadow continued to bark and thrash, his body rigid with terror. It took several minutes for him to calm down, and when he did, he collapsed onto the grass, panting and shaking. Emily knelt beside him, her heart pounding. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're okay." But as she looked into his eyes, she realized something. Shadow wasn't just reacting to the skateboard. He was reliving something awful. That night, Emily did some digging. She contacted the shelter and asked for more information about Shadow's past. The volunteer who had initially told her about him was reluctant to share details but eventually caved. "He was part of a dogfighting ring," the volunteer admitted. "The warehouse he was tied up behind? That's where they kept the dogs. He was a bait dog used to train the fighters. They'd set the fighters on him over and over just to rile them up. By the time we found him, he was barely alive." Emily felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She had suspected Shadow's scars weren't just physical, but the confirmation of his past was devastating. "That explains the way he reacts," the volunteer continued. "He doesn't trust anyone because he's never been given a reason to." Emily hung up the phone and sat in silence, her mind racing. She looked over at Shadow, who lay curled in his bed, his ears twitching in restless sleep. "You've been through so much," she whispered. "But I promise you won't ever go through it again." But keeping that promise wouldn't be easy. Shadow's trauma was deeply ingrained, and Emily's resolve would soon be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. Emily knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was determined. Shadow deserved a chance, and she wasn't going to give up on him. Over the next few weeks, she worked tirelessly to build his trust. She avoided sudden movements, spoke in calm, soothing tones, and rewarded even the smallest signs of progress. A wag of his tail, a brief glance of curiosity, or a step closer than before. But Shadow's progress was slow and unpredictable. Some days he seemed to inch closer to her, letting his guard down ever so slightly. Other days he recoiled from her as if she were his worst enemy. It was during one of these setbacks that the first crack in Emily's own resolve began to show. One evening she returned home late from the academy, exhausted from hours of drills and lectures. Shadow greeted her with his usual wary stare, his body stiff as she entered. She set her bag down and crouched to refill his water bowl. "Hey boy," she said tiredly. "Rough day, huh?" "I know the feeling." As she moved to stand, her hand accidentally knocked over a chair. The loud crash startled Shadow and he bolted from his corner, barking furiously. In his panic, he lunged at her, his teeth grazing her arm before she managed to step back. "Shadow, no," she yelled, her voice sharper than she intended. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Shadow froze, his ears pinned back and his body trembling. He slunk back to his corner, curling into a tight ball with his head buried under his paws. Emily's heart shattered. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I didn't mean to scare you." But Shadow wouldn't look at her. He stayed in his corner, his breathing ragged, and Emily knew she'd just undone weeks of hard-earned progress. The incident haunted her. She couldn't shake the image of Shadow cowering in fear, and it made her question everything. Was she equipped to help him? Could she provide what he needed, or was she only making things worse? The next day she brought him to a local trainer who specialized in rehabilitating traumatized dogs. The trainer, a kind woman named Marcy, listened carefully as Emily recounted Shadow's history and their struggles. "He's carrying a lot of baggage," Marcy said, kneeling to observe Shadow. "But he's not a lost cause. No dog is. It's going to take time, patience, and consistency. But most importantly, he needs to feel safe." Marcy showed Emily techniques to help build Shadow's confidence. Positive reinforcement, desensitization, and creating a safe space where he could retreat without fear of being disturbed. She also suggested using a calming pheromone spray to help reduce his anxiety. For a while things seemed to improve. Shadow began to relax more in Emily's presence, occasionally letting her pet him for brief moments. They developed a routine and the stability seemed to help. But just when Emily thought they were turning a corner, life threw them an unexpected curveball. One night as they returned from a late walk, Emily noticed her front door ajar. Her pulse quickened. She was certain she had locked it before leaving. "Stay here, Shadow," she whispered, tying his leash to a railing outside. She pushed the door open slowly, her heart pounding. The apartment was eerily silent, but the signs of intrusion were clear. Drawers had been emptied, her belongings scattered across the floor. A shadow moved in the corner of her eye, and before she could react, a man lunged at her. Emily tried to fight back, but he overpowered her, pinning her to the wall. Then a low, guttural growl filled the air. "Fido." The German shepherd burst through the door, his eyes locked on the intruder. He charged, his powerful jaws snapping with precision and fury. The man let go of Emily, trying to fend off the enraged dog, but Shadow was relentless. "Shadow, stop!" Emily yelled, her voice shaking. It took all her strength to pull him back, and by the time she did, the intruder was already scrambling out the door, leaving behind a trail of blood. Emily collapsed to the floor, her chest heaving. Shadow stood protectively in front of her, his body still trembling with adrenaline. For the first time, Emily saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. Not fear but trust. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You really saved me." That night, as they sat together in the wreckage of her apartment, Emily realized something profound. Shadow wasn't just a dog she had rescued. He was her partner, her protector, and her second chance at finding her own strength. But their journey was far from over. The intruder's attack had stirred something deep within Shadow, and the line between his loyalty and his lingering fear would soon be tested in ways Emily couldn't yet foresee. The aftermath of the break-in left Emily shaken but resolute. Shadow had saved her life, and for the first time she saw a glimmer of the bond she had dreamed of forming with him. But the incident also left its scars. Shadow's behavior grew more unpredictable in the weeks that followed. His protective instincts intensified to the point of aggression, especially around strangers. On walks, he would bark and lunge at anyone who came too close. Even the sound of footsteps outside the apartment sent him into a frenzy. Emily tried to reassure him, using the techniques Marcy had taught her, but nothing seemed to work. Shadow was caught in a cycle of fear and defense, and Emily felt helpless to break it. One evening, during a particularly stressful walk, Shadow's aggression reached a boiling point. A jogger passed too close and Shadow lunged, his teeth snapping inches from the man's leg. The jogger stumbled back, shouting a string of curses before storming off. Emily's hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the leash, tears stinging her eyes. She felt the weight of every judgmental glare, every whispered comment from onlookers who saw only a dangerous dog and a failing owner. When they returned home, Emily sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. Shadow paced restlessly, his ears twitching at every creak of the building. "I don't know what to do," Emily whispered. "I'm trying so hard, but it's like I'm failing you." Shadow paused, his amber eyes meeting hers. For a brief moment he seemed to understand her pain. He approached cautiously, his head low, and nudged her hand with his nose. It was the first time he had initiated contact. Emily's heart swelled. She knelt in front of him, her voice trembling. "We'll figure this out, Shadow. I promise. I'm not giving up on you." The breakthrough gave her renewed determination. She doubled down on training, consulting with Marcy and even seeking advice from a behaviorist who specialized in rehabilitating aggressive dogs. They introduced Shadow to controlled environments where he could gradually acclimate to strangers. Progress was slow and uneven, but there were moments of hope, brief periods where Shadow allowed a stranger to approach without reacting, or relaxed in a new setting without constant vigilance. One of the most surprising moments came during a visit to a local park. Emily had arranged for Marcy to bring her own dog, a calm and friendly Labrador named Milo, to help Shadow learn how to socialize. At first, Shadow was tense, his body rigid as Milo approached. But Milo was patient, maintaining a respectful distance and offering gentle signals of friendliness. Slowly, Shadow began to relax. By the end of the session, he was sniffing Milo cautiously, his tail wagging ever so slightly. "You see that?" Marcy said, smiling. "That's a big step. He's starting to trust again." The progress gave Emily hope, but life had one more test in store for them, a test that would push both her and Shadow to their limits. One evening, as they returned from a successful training session, a man stepped out from the shadows of the parking lot. Emily recognized him immediately, the intruder from the break-in. Her blood ran cold as he approached, his face twisted with anger. "You think your dog scares me," he sneered. "I'm not done with you." Shadow sensed the danger instantly. He positioned himself between Emily and the man, his body tense and his growl low and menacing. The man lunged and everything happened in a blur. Shadow launched himself forward, meeting the threat head-on. The man swung a crowbar, but Shadow was too fast, his jaws clamping down on the weapon and forcing the man to drop it. Emily's training instincts kicked in. She grabbed her phone and called 911, shouting the details of the attack as Shadow held his ground. By the time the police arrived, the man was subdued, lying on the ground with Shadow standing over him, his growl a warning not to move. The officers praised Shadow's bravery, but Emily knew the encounter had taken a toll on him. That night, as they sat together in the quiet of the apartment, she noticed the way his body trembled and his eyes darted nervously. "You're so brave," she whispered, running her fingers gently through his fur. "But you don't always have to be. It's my turn to protect you now." Shadow leaned into her touch, a deep sigh escaping him. For the first time, it felt like they were truly a team, two souls bound by their shared pain and unwavering loyalty. But Emily also knew their journey wasn't over. Shadow still had wounds that needed healing, and so did she. Together they would face whatever came next, one step at a time. Months passed and the bond between Emily and Shadow deepened in ways she hadn't thought possible. Shadow's past still lingered in the shadows of their lives, but he was slowly learning to trust and love. Emily had worked tirelessly to help Shadow overcome his fear and aggression. With guidance from Marcy and the behaviorist, she introduced him to more controlled environments. Each encounter with people or other dogs was carefully planned, with clear boundaries and a focus on positive reinforcement. But the real turning point came when Emily enrolled Shadow in a therapy training program. It was a bold decision, one that even she wasn't sure about at first. But Marcy had encouraged her, pointing out that the structured environment and meaningful purpose could help Shadow channel his energy in a positive way. The training was intense, requiring both patience and discipline. Shadow's first sessions were rocky. He would freeze, bark, or retreat when introduced to new situations. But with every passing week he grew more confident. He began to walk calmly through crowds, respond to commands with precision, and even allow strangers to approach him. Emily couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. The once broken dog who cowered in a corner now stood tall, his ears perked and his tail wagging as he greeted children in a practice session at a community center. One day, during a routine visit to the training facility, Emily was approached by a woman named Sarah, who worked with veterans suffering from PTSD. She explained how therapy dogs could provide invaluable support to individuals struggling with trauma. "I think Shadow could be one of those dogs," Sarah said, smiling. "He has the strength and the empathy. And he clearly has a connection with you that's unshakable." Emily was hesitant at first. Shadow had come so far, but she worried about the pressure such a role might put on him. However, after discussing it with Marcy and the behaviorist, she decided to give it a try. The first session was with a small group of veterans. Shadow's initial hesitation was evident. His body was tense, his eyes darting around the room. But then a man in a wheelchair reached out to him, his hand trembling as he whispered softly. "It's okay, boy," the man said. "You're safe here." Something in the man's voice seemed to resonate with Shadow. He stepped forward cautiously, his nose brushing against the man's hand. The man's face lit up, tears welling in his eyes. "That's it," Emily said softly, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Good boy, Shadow." From that day on, Shadow became a regular at the therapy sessions. His gentle demeanor and deep, knowing eyes seemed to comfort the veterans in ways words couldn't. He would sit quietly beside them, leaning into their touch as if to say, "I understand. I've been there too." Emily watched with pride and awe as Shadow blossomed in his new role. The dog who had once been so broken was now a source of healing for others. It was as if he had found his purpose, a way to turn his pain into something beautiful. But the journey wasn't just about Shadow. Emily, too, found herself changed by the experience. Her confidence grew, and she felt more prepared than ever to graduate from the academy and begin her career as a police officer. She realized that Shadow's resilience had taught her something invaluable. Strength wasn't about being unshakable. It was about getting back up no matter how many times life knocked you down. On the day of her academy graduation, Emily stood on the stage, her heart swelling with pride as her name was called. Shadow sat beside her, his head held high, wearing a special badge the academy had made for him, a symbol of his bravery and the bond they shared. After the ceremony, a little girl approached, her face lighting up as she saw Shadow. "Can I pet him?" she asked shyly. Emily smiled. "Of course. He loves making new friends." The girl knelt down, running her tiny hands through Shadow's fur. Shadow's tail wagged gently, his eyes calm and trusting. As Emily watched, she realized that the journey they had taken together, through fear, pain, and uncertainty, had led them here. Shadow wasn't just her dog. He was her partner, her teacher, and her greatest triumph. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: peace. Shadow looked up at her, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom that seemed to say, "We made it." And they had. Together they had found redemption not just in the lives they touched but in each other. The past would always be a part of their story, but it no longer defined them. They had carved out a new path, one filled with hope, love, and the unshakable bond of two souls who had saved each other.